His girlfriend says, "You better put a ring on it, mister, or otherwise she ain't touching his ding-a-ling."
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 360.
Xbox 360. Xbox circlet. They think they're smart. We ain't doing geometry. We try to play some games.
Given that it's the first episode of the new year, we made another lap around the sun. Congratulations. Figured I might do something a little revolutionary, a little out of the ordinary. Talking about a band, music group, compositional collective that I got into way back when I was a pretty young kid, because two artists whom I highly respect, that being good old Varg.
So you want to be healthy, so you eat fruit and vegetables and... you have such a good conscience, don't you?
From Burzum and good old Fenris.
Get it on, man!
From Dark Throne, said that they were pretty cool. We're going to be talking about Kraftwerk, who aren't technically a metal band in any way, shape, or form, but one might argue they are the most metal band, given the whole robot gimmick they had going.
I'm a cybernetic organism, living tissue over a metal endoskeleton.
And they certainly influenced a whole lot of metal bands. They influenced a whole lot of music in general. And they should be of particular interest to fans of the more lunatic fringe of extreme metal, particularly black metal, given that they were fairly instrumental in moving popular music away from and towards new vistas of sound. Plus, some people seem to enjoy Radio Free Innsmouth episodes 354 and 355 about Dead Can Dance, another musical group in a similar position that I got into during a similar time in my life, and who were also very influential on death metal and black metal, despite themselves not playing heavy metal in any way, shape, or form. That said, this episode isn't going to be a black metal apologia for Kraftwerk where I'm like, here's why you as a metal listener should listen to them. I'm mostly covering them because I think they do some really cool musical stuff. However, keep in mind that I did come to Kraftwerk from a heavy metal perspective, so that's undoubtedly going to color a little bit of my analysis of their music. These guys started in Germany. As a matter of fact, they started in West Germany, back when West Germany and East Germany were still a thing. They're from Dusseldorf, and they were part of an important kind of post-hoc music constructed by the international music press, pejoratively entitled Krautrock, specifically the Dusseldorf school of that Frankenstein of a genre. They also weren't originally called Kraftwerk. The two fellows that would become the backbone of Kraftwerk's musical enterprise, that being Ralf Hütter and Florian Schneider, initially started off their musical journey as part of a larger ensemble cast called Organization, which at various points in time also included Klaus Dinger and Maiko Rota, who would later go on to found the seminal proto-electronic krautrock band Neu. Organization only put out one full-length album entitled Tone Float that's been out of print for a very long time and is really only available as a bootleg these days, although apparently there's some weird unofficial digital release that's been floating around recently. Most of this album sounds like the intro to this episode, that weird semi-ambient, partially improvised, soundscapey sort of thing that I started the show off with. But there is one track in particular on this Tone Float album that presages a lot of where Kraftwerk would end up going musically later on. That would be the song Milk Rock. This one's still got a little bit of that semi-improvised loosey-goosiness to it, but it's much more rigidly structured than any other song on the album, and it has a very mechanistic, percussive kind of feeling, with a drum part that probably would have been played on a drum machine had it been recorded 6 or 7 years later, and a startlingly stark and very heavy bass line over which you have these oddly tape-treated flute anti-melodies kind of floating around. It's a super interesting song, and I liked it a lot. Unfortunately, the world at large did not like Organization's Tone Float album that much, and they ended up breaking up soon after release, with Florian and Ralph reconnecting to form Kraftwerk, and Klaus and Michael kind of building off of the Milk Rock sound with their new band Neu, who are very much worth listening to, and do a lot of interesting beat-heavy stuff when they're not too busy making weird ambient farting sounds.
Whoa!
I'm just kidding, Neu's pretty cool. But we're here to talk about Kraftwerk, who after their initial formation put out 3 albums between 1970 and 1973, that being Kraftwerk, Kraftwerk 2, and Ralph und Florian, all 3 of which are in the same situation as that Tone Float album, where they've never been reissued and they're only available as bootlegs. As a matter of fact, I get the impression that Ralf Hütter kinda hates these albums. He's referred to them as archaeology in the same way that that H.P. Lovecraft referred to his early stories like The Beast in the Cave as inconsequential juvenilia. I, however, do find these albums to be rather interesting, and hopefully they'll get some kind of remaster, re-release someday. The third one, Ralph und Florian in particular, very much set Kraftwerk on their future trajectory with its inclusion of early analog synthesizers and sequencers. This song, Cristallo, combines those early synths with a highly post-production treated kind of wah pedal guitar, which gradually and very organically morphs into that weird sequenced noise you're hearing underneath the chiming synthesizer tones. It's very futuristic sounding music for the time, and even today there's not a lot out there that sounds exactly like this sort of thing. And unlike a lot of the more improvisational kind of stuff that Organization was doing, it has a clear sort of compositional narrative to it. In that sense, one might call it neoclassical, with the emphasis on neo, due to its incorporations of all these new weirdo elements that you weren't really seeing in a lot of popular music at the time. My personal favorite song from this era of Kraftwerk, however, doesn't go as heavy with the electronic elements, but it feels more like a later Kraftwerk song in terms of how rigidly it's constructed and how effectively it communicates a sort of story through instrumental sound. I'm talking about the song Ruckzuck off of the very first Kraftwerk album. This one prominently features Florian Schneider's acoustic and electric flutes as its primary musical backbone, running through a lot more interesting textural variations for that kind of instrument than you might expect. You might recognize this song as the theme song for Newton's Apple, a particularly nostalgic show from my childhood that was essentially a much more serious counterpart to Bill Nye the Science Guy. It also didn't feature a weirdo host that went on to craft a hip-hop musical about transgendered ice cream. But here comes that structure I've been talking about. Very intentional collapse section to the music that still preserves that flute motif in a very degraded form before it too is swallowed up by flange and cymbal noise. And then we have a dramatic re-emergence, this sort of rise and fall and rise again action, as well as the incorporation of a leitmotif. Very much a Wagnerian way of writing music. Definitely existing outside of the pop paradigm at the time while still being very catchy. And some more modernistic incorporation of dissonance for the song's second collapse, which is less dramatic, but even more strange sounding in some ways. A lot of weird unfurled fragments of melody that eventually tie themselves back together for a double-time rendition of the song's primary musical backbone from its intro. Ruckzuck, super cool song, and honestly, it's the primary reason why I disagree with Ralph when he says there isn't much of value going on with these first three Kraftwerk albums. I think they bring a lot of cool stuff to the table. But it always is kind of interesting when you get a band that kind of completely diverges from their early work, and often it leads to a lot of angst amongst their listenership. I'm thinking of like Dark Throne with the massive jump in styles between Soulside Journey and A Blaze in the Northern Sky. Not sure why there aren't as many people upset about Kraftwerk kind of doing the same thing. I mean, maybe there just aren't that many fans of weird, avant-garde, noisy krautrock as there are of old school death metal in the world. Maybe it's a case of or maybe it's just because these albums are impossible to find and really only exist as bootlegs nowadays. Whatever the case, we're closing the book on that early era of Kraftwerk. And moving into their classic era, which features a stream of absolutely incredible albums. The first of which, 1974's Autobahn, is something of a bridge between the Ralph und Florian era and the modern Kraftwerk sound, but also a complete repudiation of their earlier material. No real weird improvisational stuff going on here at all. The last two tracks on the album are probably the closest to that noisy sound they were going with early on, but even then, they're still very different because they're very concrete, Apollonian musical landscapes directed towards crafting a very strict image in the listener's mind. The first of these, Mitternacht or Midnight, is one of the darkest pieces of music I've ever heard. Like, if you're into the really dark, crusty, abrasive side of dungeon synth, this should appeal to you. With its repeated dark motifs, kind of swamped in a noise of odd strings and dissonant flutes provided by Florian and new member Klaus Ruder. on the electric violin there. The motif moves from the rather gentle organ sound to this much more aggressive and direct synthesizer noise as the song goes on. There's also an interesting music concrete element with their utilization of dripping water noises, treated to become much more oppressive sounding. Essentially what Kraftwerk have done here is craft the best black metal intro track of all time in terms of actually being musically interesting, way before black metal even existed. I fucking love Mitternacht, and nobody ever talks about this song from what I've seen. On the opposite side of the emotional spectrum, we have the other landscape piece of this album, Morgen Spaziergang, or Morning Walk, that uses synthetic elements to craft a sort of park landscape complete with a whole lot of bird song, provided entirely by manipulation of synthesizers. It's kind of like crafting an impressionistic landscape out of Legos and Erector sets, if you were able to do so in a way that was actually entirely convincing to the naked eye. Then comes Florian with the flute leitmotif that dominates the latter half of the song, again very Wagnerian in that sense. And as we move forward, we get synthesizers simulating the motion of sunlight via these delicate rising actions, as well as these weird whistling synth noises being used to mimic the sound of water. I'd call it ambient music, except it's way less background noise and much more creation of a world via sound. As we move towards the song's conclusion, the leitmotif is bolstered with extra flute overdubs, guitars, other keyboards coming in, kind of backing everything up. They even bring in some very classical sounding piano music as the motif kind of wraps around itself in sort of a round structure, where Mitternacht really communicated darkness very effectively via the medium of early electronic music. Morgen Spaziergang puts forth its equal opposite in the form of a manifestation of sunlight and daytime. The other three songs in this release, that being the two Kometen melodies, as well as the Mammoth title track, don't really indulge in the same sort of ambient music, although they are kind of program music in a sense, particularly Autobahn, which, I gotta say,
What are you, from the department of Noam Sands? You taking the Noam census? You counting my Noam Sands? We're hanging out, right? It's all
8 or
good.
9 times? That's
But you
too
see
many
what I'm
Noam
saying?
Sands,
Riding
you know
on
what
my
I'm saying?
jock, you know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to have a good time, you know what I'm saying?
is one of the best pieces of music ever written. It perfectly combines the programmatic ambient aspect of recreating the experience of driving a car via constructions through electronic music with the neoclassical long-form progressive rock structure of a musical suite. The song starts out with this repeated fanfare of electronically treated vocals made into something of a military trumpet line signaling the beginning of our journey. And what a journey it's going to be. As we get our first instance of the major bass motif of this song, this repeated backbone that eases us into this musical juggernaut, much like a car warming up. We have the blooming of very bright, sunny synthesizers opening up to reveal the vocals. Which managed to be very synthetic and robotic sounding while still maintaining a great degree of warmth and congeniality. From here we have a descending melodic action moving into the first major musical shift of the piece. And I use the term shift intentionally because the band themselves have stated that not only do these shifts in musical structure signify new movements in the piece, but they're also supposed to simulate shifting gears on a car as you get farther out onto the highway. Here we've got the introduction of flute from Florian and guitar from Klaus Rode as the wide road opens before us. The song earns its 20-minute runtime because it's got all these different gear shift sections to it, each heralded by that descending melodic figure and then an actual sort of shifting noise. From there we get into the heavier section of the song, which shows off the talents of the other new member of Kraftwerk at this time, that being Wolfgang Flür, who takes over the electronic percussion in a very effective fashion that also allows Ralph to really open up his synth arrangements even more. You've got that repeated bass line kind of mimicking the sound of horn honks. You've got these weird swooshing noises simulating the noise of tires on the road and other cars passing with a bit of a Doppler effect. And you also have the actual melodic synthesizers kind of opening up with these droning long-form melodies that coalesce into something that's not entirely normal pop music, but is rather pop-like in its catchiness. You could definitely hear why a composer like Varg with songs like Det som en Gangbar, and other ode and pop classics would claim some influence from Kraftwerk songs like Autobahn. As we move towards the end of the song, the mood gradually brightens from that traffic jam as the synthesizers wrap around the very bright vocal patterns. It's a testament to the economy of composition going on here that this song works just as well in its 7-inch single 3-minute long version as it does in its 20-minute long entire LP side musical journey version. And it's one of the most influential pieces of music ever written. Like, just in general on any electronic music going forward, it has a little bit of Autobahn in its DNA, or the really long narrative-driven Burzum pieces got a lot of that in there. Even death metal bands like Gorefest took some influence from this song, and those guys actually ended up covering it. And it's actually a recognizable cover of that song. Obviously, Jan Krista Koyer's vocals not quite mimicking what was going on in that song, but I think they maintained something of that bright quality despite being all death metal. And they nail the shift sections. I mean, you gotta love this era of Ed Warby's drumming. It really speaks to his talent as a percussionist that he's able to reinterpret Kraftwerk in such a savage manner without losing sight of the overall spirit of that song, at least to my ears. So where do we go from there? Well, the next Kraftwerk album, Radioactivity, little play on words. They're getting radio airplay, but, it's also very dark, post-apocalyptic, nuclear paranoia influenced stuff. Their 1975 album, a much darker and more stark affair, and that's not only because of the stark black and white cover art. The synth noises themselves, this Geiger counter sounding introductory percussion, leading into these ghostly orchestron choirs. The motifs themselves, a whole lot darker and more minor key this time around. I also like these weird wind-like electronic bursts of static, kind of sounding like exhaust gas from some kind of terrible machine breaking down on itself. And then check out the vocal hook here. It's also a lot darker. And I really like how it almost mathematically slides into place between those repetitions of the central melodic motif of the song. And just because it's dark doesn't mean it's entirely malevolent. They can dip into major keys that give off almost kind of a divine presence at times. But it is a whole lot darker than anything Kraftwerk had done before, with the possible exception of that Mitternacht track that I was gushing about a little while back there. In some ways, this album even harkens back to the more experimental elements of those first 3 Kraftwerk albums in a way that Autobahn kind of abandoned. Because you got these big neoclassical suites, but they're submerged in this sea of shorter, kind of more collage style tracks, like this one right here. It's entitled News, and as you're hearing right now, it's mostly this weird collage of heavily degraded clips of news broadcasts with intermittent electronic noises emerging from underneath the din that kind of coagulate into little bursts of melodic ideas that are then submerged back under the sea of noise. Definitely a weird sort of artsy thing going on here. I enjoy it, but it definitely works best as kind of little 1-minute segues between the more involved and melodic compositions. And because Kraftwerk are smart guys, that's how they chose to go about incorporating this sort of thing. That sort of noisiness does bleed over into the more involved songs in a rather interesting way, like on the song Antenna, where you have these almost proto-hip-hop narrative parts bouncing off of these rather harsh but still very melodious segue sections that eventually tie themselves back around to more vocal utterances that then herald the advent of more complex, entirely instrumental sections. They managed to use rather harsh synthesized noises in a intriguingly melodious way. Definitely one of the stranger, earlier Kraftwerk songs, that one. But the real standouts for this release are stuff like the title track or songs like Airwaves, where they use these very dark and minimalist synths to create something that emanates a bit of darkness without necessarily being violent or malicious. In fact, I would say this song in particular gets pretty close to being downright happy sounding. It certainly seems more at peace with itself than the tension of a song like Antenna or the abstraction of a song like News. And I really like how right here these synth arrangements open up into these overlapping streams of melody. Again, something that a band like Burzum would end up taking a whole lot of influence from. on his more drone-oriented third and fourth albums. It's all about using these very technological, sterile, mechanistic elements and using it to create a sense of cosmic harmony and naturalism in spite of the ingredients utilized. That's what makes Kraftwerk so interesting for me, and that's why this is going to be a multi-parter, all right? We're 5 albums into the discography, but I have so much more to say, and they're going to push this music in so many interesting new directions in the years to come. So hopefully you'll join me for that. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
Cobra's Candy, that's fire, son.